Welcome to the Explainer. Okay, let's dive right into this. Today, we're unpacking something absolutely crucial, the blueprint of a nation. Specifically, we're looking at the Directive Principles of State Policy, or the DSPS in the Indian Constitution. If you've ever wondered what actually guides a government when it sits down to frame a new policy or draft a law, well, you're in exactly the right place.
Here is our roadmap for today. We will start with the Constitution's blueprint, then define exactly what the DPSPs are, explore their 3 pillars of policy, compare directives versus rights, and finally, look at how the Constitution evolves.
All right, Section 1, the Constitution's blueprint. Let's set the stage. Picture this. It's 1947. India just gained independence, and the framers are looking at this massive, incredibly diverse nation. And they're faced with this huge question: how does a brand new country guarantee its citizens a good life? I mean, they weren't just setting up a government. They were trying to build a completely new society from scratch, one that actually delivered social, economic, and political justice. To do that, they needed a rock-solid set of instructions for future governments, just to make sure no one ever lost sight of that ultimate goal of human welfare.
And the stepping stones to get there? Pretty fascinating. Back in 1858, the Government of India Act established direct British Crown rule. Fast forward to 1935, and a new act introduces something called the Instrument of Instructions. Basically, these were administrative guidelines for the Governor General. Then, boom, 1947 hits, the Indian Independence Act passes, and British rule is officially over. The framers of the new Constitution looked back at that old 1935 Instrument of Instructions and realized, wait a minute, an independent, sovereign nation needs its own, way more ambitious set of instructions.
Moving right along to Section 2, what exactly are the DPSPs?
So, what are they? The Directive Principles of State Policy are found in Part 4 of the Constitution, specifically Articles 36 through 51. Basically, these are fundamental guidelines. They're meant for the central and state governments to keep front of mind when framing laws. And here is a fun fact. The framers actually borrowed this brilliant concept from the 1937 Irish Constitution, who, by the way, originally grabbed it from the Spanish Constitution. But the absolute key word to remember here is non-justiciable. That simply means if the government fails to implement these principles, you can't just take them to court and legally force them to do it. They're guidelines, not strictly enforceable laws.
To really wrap our heads around this, let's look at how Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, the father of the Constitution himself, described them. He famously called these directives novel features of the Constitution. He directly compared them to that old colonial-era Instrument of Instructions we just talked about, but he made it clear this was a massive upgrade. We aren't talking about boring administrative rules anymore. This was a full-blown economic, social, and political program for a modern democracy.
See, during the colonial era, the government basically operated as a police state, mostly just keeping order and collecting revenue. But the DSPS' ultimate goal? Creating a true welfare state. Article 38 spells this out perfectly. It directs the state to actively promote the welfare of the people by securing social, economic, and political justice. We're talking about positive obligations here, things the government absolutely must strive to do to lift up the lives of its citizens.
Which brings us to Section 3, the 3 pillars of policy.
Now, the Constitution doesn't formally split these up, but scholars generally classify the directives into 3 buckets. It's a great way to see how the framers beautifully balanced totally different socio-political philosophies. First up, the socialistic principles. These are all about economic justice. Think equal pay and the right to work. Second, we have the Gandhian principles. These are drawn directly from Mahatma Gandhi's ideology, focusing heavily on rural self-government and cottage industries. And third, the liberal intellectual principles, which really lean into modernization, liberalism, and international peace.
Let's look at a really famous example of a Gandhian principle, Article 40. This one is huge. It directs the state to organize village panchayats and give them the power they need to actually function as units of self-government. Basically, this is the very bedrock of grassroots democracy in the country. On the flip side, we have Article 44, which is a classic liberal intellectual goal, and a highly discussed one for sure. It states the government should try to secure a uniform civil code for all citizens. The idea here is to replace all the various religion-based personal laws with one common set of rules for things like marriage, divorce, and succession, really pushing for nationwide equality. Now, what's really interesting about this is seeing how these seemingly abstract constitutional concepts translated into massive, real-world impact. Take Article 41, which calls for the right to work.
That's the literal constitutional foundation for huge programs like MGNREGA, which guarantees rural employment, and the National Social Assistance Program. Or Article 39D, demanding equal pay for equal work. That gave birth to the Equal Remuneration Act of 1976. Even Article 48A, focusing on the environment, drives the country's wildlife safeguards today. So these aren't just empty words on a page, they're literally the DNA of the nation's biggest welfare schemes.
Let's shift gears to Section 4, Directives versus Rights. So how do these sweeping state directives actually interact with your individual liberties? It's a fascinating tug-of-war. On one hand, you have your fundamental rights in Part 3, which were borrowed from the U.S. Constitution. These are justiciable, meaning if your free speech is violated, you can march straight to the Supreme Court to defend it. They act as negative obligations, stopping the state from doing certain things to you. But then, on the other hand, you have the DPSPs in Part 4, borrowed from Ireland. And like we said, these are non-justiciable. They're positive obligations, things the state should do, but you can't sue the government if they don't immediately provide you with an adequate livelihood. As you can probably guess, this natural friction between individual rights and state welfare goals led to some pretty intense legal battles over the decades. But it all came to a head and was beautifully resolved by the Supreme Court in the landmark 1980 Minerva Mills case. The court essentially ruled that the entire Constitution rests on a careful balance between fundamental rights and directive principles. You can't just let one completely dominate the other, otherwise you wreck the harmony of the whole document. They have to be read together to achieve the nation's goals.
Finally, Section 5, Evolving the Constitution.
Look, a blueprint is only useful if it can adapt to the times, right? And over the years, the DSPS has absolutely evolved to reflect modern needs. A huge milestone was the 42nd Amendment Act in 1976. It slapped 4 critical new principles right into the Constitution. Securing opportunities for healthy children under Article 39, pushing for free legal aid for the poor under 39A, getting workers involved in industry management under 43A, and, arguably one of the most vital for our modern era, protecting the environment and wildlife under Article 48A. And the evolution certainly didn't stop there. Jumping into the 21st century, look at how a totally new economic engine, cooperative societies, was woven right into the nation's fabric in 2011. The 97th Amendment Act did 2 huge things. First, it actually made forming a cooperative a fundamental right. And right alongside that, it dropped a brand new directive principle, Article 43B, requiring the state to promote the democratic control and professional management of those cooperatives. It's just a perfect example of a living, breathing blueprint updating itself in real time. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a provocative thought, something to really chew on. We know you cannot drag the government to court to enforce a directive principle. But when you look at how completely these principles have shaped everything from our environmental laws to massive rural employment schemes, does the non-justiciable nature of DPSPs actually make them less powerful? Or, because they represent the ultimate welfare goals of the people, are they actually the true, enduring moral compass of a nation's laws? Thank you so much for joining me today to explore this incredible constitutional blueprint. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.